What up guys, Otterpop here, and welcome to another Dan vs. review. This is going to be the review for Season 1, Episode 12, Dan vs. George Washington. Now, before I quickly get into the recap of the review, the link to the reaction is going to be down in the description below, but first, a really quick review. Well, technically the recap and then the review, but quick recap of the episode. Dan's car is once again vandalized, and based on a little bit of evidence, he blames the dead president and travels to Mount Vernon with Chris and Elise to exact revenge. Oh boy, do I have some things to talk about. I mean, namely two, kind of one semi-big thing and another very big thing and a whole bunch of other little things, so let's just get on to the semi-big thing, because it's always the thing that I question in every single freaking episode and every single freaking review. You guys have probably heard enough about it, but I am still continuously questioning Dan's intelligence throughout every single episode. I'd probably mentioned it in either every single review or almost every single review, where I'm questioning various aspects of his personality or just his general intelligence. But here's the thing. It gets a little bit more exciting this time around. I had no idea that I ever needed/wanted this episode, but I got it, and I'm so happy. Still, there is some questionable intelligence on Dan's part. Like, first off, he doesn't accept the fact that George Washington is dead and suggests the president, hibernated for 200 years. 200 plus years. No, it's definitely been... Yeah, I think it's been about 200 years. I actually don't know when he died, but it's been close to, if not more than, 200 years at this point that George Washington has been dead, and Dan just doesn't seem to accept that fact. Not to mention that he believes in psychics, which, it's not questioning his intelligence. What does make me less sure about his intelligence is the fact that he considers psychics to be experts. Psychics are experts now. Yeah, no, I don't think so. Even so, he does know a thing or two. He does know that George Washington's house is on Mount Vernon. It's pretty common knowledge, everybody knows that, but Dan has shown multiple times over the course of this series that he lacks common sense and occasionally common knowledge as well, but apparently he knows this, so that's one thing. And he also seems to know what third person means. Now, you're probably asking yourself, why the heck am I even mentioning third person? Well, because Dan mentions it in the episode. When Chris, Elise, and Dan are talking to one another, well, at least when Chris and Elise are talking to one another, and Chris keeps saying, Dan this and Dan that. She keeps talking to Chris, and Dan just, kind of interjects and looks up at her and says, I'm right here, you don't need to be talking in the third person, and I'm like, okay, I guess Dan knows what third person is, because for those of you who don't know what that is, it's basically like what Elise did, where she referred to Dan and, saying Dan's name, like Dan this, Dan that, even though he was present in the room. That's third person. Again, first, second, third person, especially when it comes to writing stories or characters or cartoons and whatnot. It can be a little bit tricky to follow, but it was interesting that, Dan would even know what that is, because a lot of people really don't, because those points of views and whatnot can be slightly confusing, even I'll admit. Of course, Dan is trying to come up with all of these crazy reasons, how and why the president would be alive and why he would take revenge and whatnot, and I myself started getting a little bit into Dan's mindset. I have a couple times in the past. I haven't really been very successful on that front, but I, even early on in the reaction, said that, okay, in terms of, George Washington chopping down the tree on Dan's car, it's either a ghost or an impersonator, and those were my only two potential explanations, knowing the cartoon logic of this particular show, and it turns out I was actually right. I mean, I was technically partially right, because, I said ghost or impersonator, so it's not like I said, oh, it's definitely a ghost, it's gotta be a ghost, but I was on the fence between which it could be, but I was still partially right, so hooray, I can actually do that. Now, I will say that there is one big thing that I really want to talk about, that I'm really excited about talking about, but I'm actually gonna start with some, miscellaneous random stuff that happened throughout the episode as well, instead of the big thing, because I really want to talk about it. So, first off is Mr. Mumbles makes another appearance off-screen, which, is not a big deal, we've already seen him off-screen, but it's just, it added fuel to the fire at that time that, oh, Mr. Mumbles will be appearing more frequently, that means Mr. Mumbles will be potentially important character. That's what that was telling me at the time of reacting to that. And, it just made me excited. Because, obviously, the first time I ever saw Mr. Mumbles in Animal Shelter. I wanted to see him again. What was that last episode with Mr. Mumbles briefly appearing? I don't exactly remember for sure, but it made me excited. I'm like, oh, Mr. Mumbles appeared again! We're gonna be seeing that character again! And, you know, of course, seeing the, or like, making, or like, you know, we hear Mr. Mumbles off screen or something like that, and I'm just like, yes! That's all I could think at the time. And then when Chris and Dan go to a psychic known as Madame Zelda, I mean, I didn't know this initially, but apparently she's like a spoof or parody of an individual named Miss Cleo. Again, I've never heard of her, but she was apparently a psychic born in Jamaica, don't mind the air quotes, who was an infomercial television psychic, but there were some problems with some deceptive advertising and some potential fraud or whatnot, so, but I guess, you know, thinking about it now, I can absolutely see the parallels, because it still bothers me that Dan even considered the psychics to be experts, but in that particular psychic as well. It pained me. It pained me throughout the entirety of watching her on screen that Dan was buying into any of this, because she clearly had no idea what she was talking about, and even Chris could see it, but Dan couldn't because I guess he's a freaking idiot. But I mean, again, don't get me wrong, I'm not a big fan of psychics, it doesn't logically make sense, and this is my brain we're talking about. I am a scientific and logical individual most of the time. I love how I point on the right side of my brain when I should be, you know, pointing to the left side of my brain, but you get the picture. Then later on in the episode, when Chris, Dan, and Elise were driving through, I think it was Nebraska or something like that, but there was a bunch of open space and prairies around, and Chris was starting to lose it, and Elise eventually told Dan that it was prairie madness, which is something that has been linked to agoraphobia, which when I immediately heard that, I was like, oh yeah, like the fear of the outside world, but I kind of knew that that wasn't fully right at the time, but it was the only thing that I could think of, and I was partially right. I wasn't fully right, but I was partially right, since agoraphobia is actually, like, you know, fear of the outside world and, you know, fear of the safety of your outside environment, especially in big open spaces. But as soon as I saw that, it kind of got me to thinking, so I'm like, oh, maybe there is a link between prairie madness and agoraphobia, so I did just a little bit of research, and sure enough, there was actually a little bit of a link between the two conditions, and I'm like, see, that's interesting stuff. That's really cool. You know, Dan Versus can really like to, you know, sneak in some random stuff from time to time. And again, the only reason that I was really thinking about that was because, you know, prairie madness, agoraphobia, like phobias and mental conditions, or, you know, mental diseases, or even, like, you know, biological diseases relating to fungi, bacteria, viruses, things like that. Like, pathology in general, and psychology as well, just fascinate me. I don't know why, but those kinds of subjects have always fascinated me, so that's probably why I was a slight bit hyper-focused on that, or at least, you know, hyper-focused on the idea of, well, I don't fully know what prairie madness is, but I do know what agoraphobia is, and maybe there is a link between them, and maybe I'd like to look it up. Sure enough, there was a link. And last little random thing that I kind of want to mention is how I'm still a little bit confused as to why George Washington even chopped the tree that landed on Dan's car in the first place, because sure, you know, Dan was, you know, grunting angrily at the president during the night, but it's not like he actually vowed revenge at that point. And yes, he's an angry little man who is, you know, being all grumpy and stuff, and, you know, about to curse out George Washington's name, but it's like, but all that happened before Dan even did anything drastic, so why would George Washington even chop down the tree in the first place? It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Whatever. I'm gonna leave it as, you know, some weird random cartoon logic, because the next topic that I want to talk about is the biggie. The one that I've been really excited to talk about, and the reason that, honestly, this episode may be one of my favorites so far. I'd say the biggest reason why I think I liked this episode as much as I did, even by the very end of it, was because this was an episode that really started to explore Dan and Elise's relationship. The relationship between Dan and Elise has been explored a little bit before. They've been on friendly terms in some episodes, they've been on neutral ground in a few episodes, and very unfriendly terms in other episodes, like, you know, say, for instance, Animal Shelter. But this was a really interesting episode that focused pretty heavily on their relationship, and, like, mostly the two of them, but also a little as it pertained to Chris, but it was fascinating nonetheless for a variety of reasons. So I think it was starting about halfway through the episode, after Chris's first Prairie Madness mental breakdown, whatever it was, I noticed that Dan and Elise seemed to be on unusually friendly terms while they were driving in the car, with, Dan complimenting Elise's driving, and, Dan happy not to have to talk about food like he clearly does with Chris a lot. I'm not surprised. And Elise absolutely agreeing with him. And as soon as I heard that, I'm like, okay, that's weird. That makes me... It didn't make me nervous necessarily, but I did think it was a little bit unusual at the time. And there was definitely a good reason for that, because it continues. There's more. You guys all know the scene, and if you don't know the scene, then you have to watch that freaking segment of the reaction. If you haven't already, you absolutely should, but everybody should know it by this point. The scene where the three of them are at Mount Vernon, they're in tents, not far from Mount Vernon, and Elise openly states that she wonders why Chris and Dan are friends. She openly says that. But then it decided to throw us with the curveball of Elise immediately afterwards saying that she gets it since Dan is like a big kid, and my mind couldn't process for a moment. I'm like finally! Initially I was thinking, Elise is asking the question, finally somebody is asking the question, why Dan and Chris are friends, but then saying she gets it because Dan is like a big kid, and I'm like, whoa, time out. What did you just say? Excusez-moi? Granted, I had initially said in a past few reactions as well as reviews that there might be a sort of semi-parent-child relationship between both Dan and Chris and Dan and Chris, and Elise and Dan. I suggested that on a number of occasions, but suddenly, as soon as I was watching this, I'm like, wait, could I have been more right than I anticipated? Just the way that Elise speaks to Dan is the same way that a mother would speak to a child. Now granted, I'm not a mother myself, but I know my mother, and I know that especially when I was a little bit younger, even though I don't remember all of it, those are the same kinds of words and tone that, she would use to speak to me. And I've also babysat enough kids of all different kinds of ages, ranging from 4 years old to 12 years old. I've babysat a variety of, kids of different ages, but even I remember speaking to them in very similar ways as well, depending on, what they were doing and what their personality was. You have to be different with every kid, but I recognized that I could hear the very motherly tone in Elise's voice, and and the longer continued in the tent scene, I was just, my mind was absolutely blown. I could not believe what I was hearing, and I could not believe that Elise was in a way encouraging this. And then you got Chris on the side, who's just staring at Elise with a gaped mouth like, what are you doing? Are you doing this? Are you encouraging this? But the entire scene, the entire minute and a half, whatever it was, it felt longer than that, but I'm pretty sure that's about how long it was. But it just blew my mind the longer I was listening to it. I could not believe what Elise was saying, because it was something I never even conceived, but it didn't make sense, but it did. But I didn't know how to process it. Also, Dan's constant whining throughout the entirety of the tent scene, the mom, like that kind of, whining tone. Kids do it all the time, and you would know about it, especially if you had a kid. But his whining just kind of reinforced my idea of calling him a man-child multiple times throughout the series, both in the reactions as well as the reviews. But she just talks to him like a mother would to a child. And Dan is asking to tell me a story, and Elise does, and it's just, what she says is crazy enough, but it's what she says mixed with the tone. It's something that's difficult to describe. Seriously, either you guys know what I'm talking about, or you haven't yet watched the scene that I'm talking about, and my reaction to it, you need to watch it, because it'll make more sense, because I couldn't. I literally could not. While Chris and Dan are at Mount Vernon and, trying to come up with a plan, or at least Dan has, and Chris is just kind of following along. Elise even helps them out a little bit. She doesn't normally help them out. This was a weird instance because, you know, I feel like normally whenever she helps out with Dan's crazy plans, they usually, you know, involve childhood traumas or her job in some way, but no, there was literally no reason. She even said at the beginning of the episode, Chris, you want to help Dan take down Mount Vernon? Are you kidding me? In that, you know, angry mother voice. But in the end, she ends up even helping them in like very small ways too, and even by the time Dan is done, and literally all he does is write an entry in George Washington's journal, just basically insulting / embarrassing the guy in some way, but at least compliments Dan's like sort of inventive and only slightly destructive plan. She compliments him on that. She had no reason to go along with anything that was happening. True, she did prevent bombs from going off by basically turning them into fireworks instead, but what? She had no reason to help, but she did, and she even complimented Dan's end result and plan by the end of it. What? This episode, in terms of their relationship, just took turns, so many turns in ways that I was not expecting, and frankly, even now, this is the strongest I've ever seen their relationship. I was absolutely blown away. Like, I think the last, like, 5-8 minutes or something like that, I was just staring in complete awe. I was not believing anything that I was seeing or hearing, and for good reason, too. When you're watching that for the first time and you're not expecting it, you can't prepare for that. You're just caught completely off guard by what happens because you think you know enough about the relationship after 11 episodes, but then comes in this episode and a couple of particular scenes, and you're just like, wait, this changes so much. I mean, it doesn't change a lot necessarily, but it kind of changes my perception of how I viewed their relationship initially. Like, it could be stronger at some point, but this is definitely the strongest I've seen it thus far, and I just wasn't expecting the explanation to even exist that, you know, at least gets why Dan and Chris are friends, because, you know, Dan is like a big kid. I just wasn't prepared for that explanation, and I mean, I guess I kind of get it, but at the same time I still don't. It's a weird fence that I'm on right now. It's just mind-boggling. That's all I can say. Even so, after watching my reaction again, I think I appreciate the episode a little bit more than I initially did. I was just initially blown away. But upon rewatch, I was like, wait a minute. There's a lot more to this than that. And I think kind of for that reason, it might honestly be one of my favorite episodes thus far. Again, I'm not entirely sure. I still feel like I have to watch through a lot more. Well, no, I should probably watch through the entire series before I start really making any determinations on my favorite episodes. Like, say, you know, maybe I do a top 10 list eventually. I don't exactly know, but I'd need to watch like all 50-ish episodes before I could even think about doing that. Or maybe I make my 5 favorite after the first season reactions end or something. I don't know. That's a good question. But anyways, loved this episode, loved watching the crazy conversations and development and growth, if you want to call it that, especially between Dan and Elise. Kind of Chris too, but to a much lesser extent. So thank you all for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the reaction as well as the review. I certainly enjoyed talking a little bit about, you know, the relationship in the review, but that's just me. And as usual, until the next video, guys, check you laters. Wow.